So let's talk about assembling an army of infantry, tanks and artillery, and putting the tenacious ranks of the Emperor's mortal soldiers on the tabletop. Time for a few thoughts on starting a new Astra Militarum army. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Guard once again, and in this video I thought it would be good to do a focused update on the Start Collecting Astra Militarum video for the channel, given a new codex has come out and changed a good number of things, alongside a whole bunch of new models and rules. In the video I'll talk through a bunch of reasons why you might want to start Guard in the first place, a bunch of ideas for planning an army and putting your own regiment on the tabletop, some ideas for model purchases and getting a bunch of tanks and infantry on the tabletop, and a few thoughts on codex rules with an example basic army list. Loads to talk about for the Hammer of the Emperor, so let's jump straight in. First up, why might you want to collect the Astra Militarum in the first place, of course also known as the Emperor's Imperial Guard. Guard are really quite a popular faction in Warhammer 40K and probably not too hard to understand why. They're probably the most relatable out of any of the armies. Mortal humans trying to face down the sheer horrors of the Warhammer 40k universe with no massive augmentations or power armor, and bravely doing their duty and holding the line against alien horrors and chaos mutants. Compared with most Warhammer 40k armies, their forces are perhaps the most recognisable, a much more traditional military structure than the majority of factions out there. Fairly recognisable tanks, infantry and artillery, a lot of it themed around, say, early 20th century sort of designs, but certainly plenty of 40k weirdness as well, lots of scout walkers, plasma guns and Imperial adornments, a fun style of their own, mixing a whole bunch of real world tropes with the grim darkness of the far future. The Guard are drawn up in countless regiments from across the galaxy, varying massively in local fighting style and all wearing different kits. Their formations will typically make use of mass ranks of huge amounts of infantry, overwhelming the enemies with numbers, and equipped with basic mass-produced kit such as flak armor and the lasgun, and then usually backed up by some chunky tanks with some massive ordnance, brave cavalry charges, and a pounding barrage of artillery from guns far behind the lines. For their miniature range, they're one of the largest miniature ranges in Warhammer 40k, one of 40k's oldest and most established factions. They've got almost as many unique unit datasheets as the Space Marines do in their core book these days. As you'd expect for that, their kits do vary in age really quite drastically. There's still a bunch of stuff that are really quite old plastics. The 10th edition Codex update basically retired some of the last of their metal models. They did receive a whole bunch of new recently redone kits with the Deathcore of Krieg line, which translated a core chunk of their Forge World range into new shiny plastic. The last couple of editions has been at least fairly good for Guard releases. They had a whole bunch of Cadian shock troops released in 9th edition, and I think that has made quite a big difference to the quality of sculpts of their core range. Games Workshop used to produce really quite a massive amount of sculpts for various different metal ranges of different regiments, but these went away in the past. Now the core supported options are Cadians, Kaschans and Deathcore of Krieg, and if you want some different themed regiments beyond that, you might need to look to third-party providers. The biggest criticisms, it feels like the Kaschan Jungle Fighters range could really have done with an update a long time ago. Maybe they'll get some release in the future. And Guard used to have a really massive range of Forge World models, most of which have gone out of production in 10th edition, with Games Workshop removing Forge World from Warhammer 40k as a main offering. For a taste of their miniatures, we've got the infantry on the left, some Cadian shock troops armed with lasguns, holding the line on some objectives, maybe being directed by that Cadian Castellan officer in the fancy hat just next to them. Behind them is a Leman Russ battle tank, a big lumpen tank but really quite powerful, and this one's the Punisher variant with the Gatling cannon. On the right we've got an Attilan Rough Rider cavalry, bringing classical cavalry charges to the battlefields of the far future, and behind that we've got an armoured sentinel armed with a plasma cannon, scouting out the enemy and providing a bit of firepower against enemy vehicles, and then the massive great big cruise missile tractor that is the Death Strike, all ready to try and turn one part of the enemy's deployment zone into a wave of plasma death. The Guard do have loads of variation though. Here we've got some Abhuman Auxilia on the left, Ogrins, Bulgrin and Ratlings can fight alongside the more traditional regiment units. Commissars brutally enforce morale in the ranks, ready to summarily execute any guardsman that is trying to flee. There's a Cadian heavy weapon team on the bottom right, armed with a heavy bolter to provide some covering fire, and then looming at the back is an enormous Baneblade, a huge super heavy vehicle particularly well known from the Dawn of War games. Alongside all that, they also have a sub-range in the Tempestus Scions, sort of special forces dropping in from the skies with special weapons, armed with the finest gear and training that the Guard have, like their hotshot lasguns, and here's the Taurox Prime transport to get them from A to B. As mentioned recently, they've had their Deathcore of Krieg range redone, some really quite nice models here. Their soldiers fighting in sort of World War II style gear with gas masks, and they're famously unfazed by laying down their lives for the cause and the Emperor if the situation demands it of them. In the background here we've got a sandbagged artillery team and a Deathcore command squad to dish out the orders. One downside of collecting Guard is certainly the pricing. They have a well-deserved reputation for being one of the very most expensive armies to collect in Warhammer 40k historically. Collections and armies are often building up and getting together over time, at least partly due to the fact that the average human isn't really all that powerful in Warhammer 40k, and you often need quite a lot of them if you want to field some big infantry formations. And outside of the main battle tanks, a lot of their vehicles are also maybe similarly not really the most powerful things in the world. As a result, really quite a lot of the Guard kits, and perhaps in particular some of the recently redone ones, tend to have absolutely terrible points per dollar, like these Cadian shock troops at 1.2. And typically if you are sticking mainly to Games Workshop kits, you might be best off to focus on tanks a little bit, as they tend to be a bit better for those ratios if you want to get towards an army size of any one level. Gameplay-wise, the Guard have recently had their Codex redone, their 10th edition book giving them a number of new ways to play and updates to their units. Classically though, the Guard have always been a really very ranged focus army, typically cheap hardy infantry to move into the midboard and survive on the objectives while the enemy tries to dislodge them, with big tanks and artillery in the backfield, often being your mainline damage dealers, or perhaps some fancy special weapon troopers dropping out of the sky or jumping out of transport with some elites like Cadian Kazakin or Tempestus Scions. They do have a couple of melee units like the Bullgrin and the Rough Riders, but typically they tend to do far better at shooting than in close combat. Their core rule for 10th edition is orders, basically having a fun little command structure, where most of your heroes will usually be officers who can bark commands to squads nearby. And these can give you really quite a lot of flexibility for how you use your units. They can get an extra 3-inch movement, which can often be pretty massive, turn up the heat with a +1 to hit, or take cover against enemy attacks, which can be nice for infantry trying to survive the onslaught that's going to hit them in return. Detachments wise, I'll talk through them a little bit more later, but they have 6 different playstyles, with one being general purpose, one Scion heavy, one tank heavy, and one transport heavy, and another couple mainly focusing on infantry. Currently, with what we know of their digital download points, I'd say the majority of units in the Guard are really quite usable power-wise. If you really want to use any one unit, the majority of them are at least passably usable, though there's definitely some things that Games Workshop seem wanting to keep niche in one way or another. In 10th edition, typically artillery, fortifications and flyers tend to be underpowered, and the super heavies aren't having the best time of it either. At time of recording, it's really quite early days for the Guard Codex, though power-wise they're initially looking really quite strong to me. They've got a whole bunch of strength on their datasheets, and have gained some further interesting ways to play. They were looking fairly strong before the Codex, and I still think that they will be now. In any case, if you want to fight with an army of normal humans, holding their line against the onslaught of the 40k galaxy, and expending the lives of the Emperor's servants, while the big tanks, fancy elites and cavalry get the job done, the Imperial Guard might be for you. If you do go down the route of collecting Astra Militarum, bear in mind all the other places that you can find out more information. The Codex is generally a good idea to pick up at some stage. That one's got all the unit profiles and rules from Games Workshop. They can go by other third-party sources like, say, New Recruit and Warhapedia, which typically tend to collate information for the Guard all in one place. Seeing as the Codex's rules haven't been out for too long at time of recording, it might take them a little while to update, but I'm sure they'll be there in the not too distant future. If you want to do a bit of trying before you buy, then Tabletop Simulator or Proxy and Models could be handy enough. Could maybe give you an idea of how your army might play on the tabletop and whether or not you enjoy that playstyle. And of course there's loads of content here on YouTube as well. I made a full Guard Codex overview which rounds up all the rules changes and how things are looking at the moment. I'll link that down in the video description. And also made a recent tier ranking of the units as well. I'm hoping to talk about a few specific ones in unit reviews in days to come. Otherwise though, there's masses of Guard content out here on YouTube. Battle reports, painting guides and lore videos. It's really not hard to find stuff with a whole bunch of searches. I certainly recommend checking out Mordian Glory if you're new to the Guard as well, as it's pretty great to have a dedicated channel focused to the Astra Militarum. Finally, it's worth following along with social media as well. All the major 40k factions have their own Discord servers, Facebook groups and subreddits. Wherever you choose to get your social media, it can be interesting enough to follow along with those, seeing some nice pictures of painted models, looking at some common discussion topics, and just imbibing a fair bit of people's thoughts and opinions via osmosis, and can be a nice enough place to ask a few basic questions to more experienced collectors. Otherwise, before you dive right in, it's worth maybe having a bit of a think as to what sort of Guard army you might want to wind up with, as the Astra Militarum really are a force that could have something really quite balanced, or you could go down one trope if you wanted to. Before buying anything, it could be worth messing around and planning out a rough 1,000 point or 2,000 point army list, just so you've got some idea as to what that could actually look like. Maybe using New Recruit or the Warhammer 40k app. I'd say the vast majority of collectors tend to build balance to some extent, and then maybe once they've got a core of a force established, perhaps skew it in one way if they particularly want to play one particular playstyle. I do feel like compared with the majority of armies of Warhammer 40k though, Guard perhaps have some of the strongest sub-themes within their army. You could go for a mass infantry company with just fielding tons and tons of bodies and outnumber the foe. You could go mechanised infantry and do a sort of Armageddon Steel Legion kind of theme, lots of people jumping out of transports or Tauroxes or the like. You could do a tank company and really focus on the heavy armour, maybe some minimal support infantry units to back them up. You could collect primarily Tempestus Scions, they maybe don't work amazingly as an entirely standalone force, but you can certainly go really heavy on them if you want to, particularly with the Bridgehead Strike detachment, or you could go fairly artillery heavy, have a lot of big guns to sit at the back, though admittedly this one's one that Games Workshop has made super weak in 10th edition, due to indirect fire kind of being a bit overpowered whenever it gets too strong. Adding into all that, you could certainly add allies such as knights or imperial agents or assassins if you wanted to mix things up. A few of those could be interesting enough to fill some different battlefield roles, as well as just the general archetypes you could collect to one detachment of the Codex, or theme a force around one of the regiments in the lore. Speaking of which, the Guard definitely has some interesting themes with their regiments. Here's a selection of perhaps the most well-known ones. From left to right, we've got those gas mask Death Corps of Krieg all ready to lay down their lives for the Emperor. The hard-bitten Kachan jungle fighters, hailing from their death world, they produce some of the hardiest fighters out there that can survive anything, basically an army of mini Rambos. The Cadian shock troops from the now destroyed world of Cadia, the orphan regiments from their home world are operating across quite a wide sector now, and particularly fierce against chaos. Otherwise, we have the firstborn sons of the Vostruans fighting with relic weapons handed down over the generations, grueling attrition warfare of the Valhallan Ice Warriors, kind of Russian infantry sort of themed in greatcoats, the authoritarian Mordian Iron Guard, rather puritanical against the forces of chaos after a great uprising on their homeworld, the well-equipped Armageddon Steel Legion, specialist orc hunters, often recruiting from the hive gangs, and typically operating as mechanised infantry out of chimeras or other transports, and finally the fast-moving Talon Desert Raiders, quite liking their tank formations and doing a bit of fast-moving desert warfare, outflanking the enemy and hitting them super hard. Generally, as with the most of Warhammer 40K in 10th edition, the regiments are maybe more for theming than giving in-game rules, though that's maybe a little bit less true of the Guard than for some. There's also the option of fielding a mixed force as well if you want to, going down the route of a regiment assembled from multiple different worlds with different squads being given to one army or another, so maybe having some Death Corps alongside some Kathchans or some other mix. As mentioned earlier though, the ones that are represented in plastic from Games Workshop are the Cadian shock troops, perhaps somewhat slightly more generic, Starship Troopers-y sort of guard, whose base gear could be adapted to quite a few themes. The Death Corps Krieg with their recent release wave, which we talked about earlier, and then the Kachan jungle fighters that have some fairly old kits, and basically each of these three ones all have datasheets in the Codex that denote them as, say, a Kachan infantry squad, a Cadian one, or a Death Corps, or the same for their heavy weapons and command squads. This can be a bit weird, particularly if you say fielding an army where you want your theme to be Cadians. It's a bit odd having some of your datasheets effectively kind of locked out to Death Corps, particularly as you might want to use them. I feel like there's multiple different ways that you can do with that though, either potentially just model everything as Cadian and just make sure that the different units have the right gear to represent what you're trying to go for. So say have Cadian shock troops and then just use them as Kachan jungle fighters with a couple of flamers and maybe some different marking on their shoulder pads or something so you can tell them apart. Or go down the sort of mixed regiment approach and have different aesthetics within the same army for the people drawn from different worlds. Then, as mentioned, other than regiment theming, you could base things on one of the various different detachments. These are the list from the new Codex plus the Bridgehead Strike, which is available as a digital download from Warhammer Community. I mentioned their themes briefly earlier, so I won't repeat myself too much here. The Combine one is fairly balanced and gives you a shooting boost. The Recon one is mainly infantry focused and focused on platoon units surviving in the midfield. The Siege Regiment, again, is infantry focused and has a few rules to represent sort of covering fire from guns off the table, though they don't directly damage the enemy. Hammer of the Emperor is tank focused, not really so much damage or defense, but mainly on getting fast movement to get lines of sight and outmaneuver the enemy. Mechanized Assault gives you some big damage boosts for things jumping out of transports, nice enough for Kazakin and Scions, and Bridgehead Strike is the Militarum Tempestus focused one with advanced infantry style rules, dropping around the board for big damage and returning to reserves as needed. You certainly could just take one of those detachments and build an army that could work around it, with the specific things that you might want for certain stratagems or combos. Then finally, when you've decided on a more general purpose guard force or going down one theme, one of the next things to do in terms of planning a force is to paint up a test model. Likely an infantry guardsman with a lasgun would be a good start, either a Cadian shock trooper, Kachan jungle fighter, or Death Corps of Krieg, unless you're doing something different with alternative infantry. This allows you to get to work on your colour scheme, get it worked out, before you go for something bigger investment like a big tank or vehicle or character. Generally, I'd say that guardsmen are pretty easy to paint up as they go. You can spray in the block colour of the armour and then pick out the cloth and details in a different paint. I found guard hordes to be not the hardest thing to paint up in big numbers from that myself. and they can do okay with contrast paints as well, particularly for the sort of cloth thing as under the armour. The vehicles can be a bit of a pain though if you want to pick out every rivet. They do have really quite a lot of armour detail and plates there. They can certainly take a little bit longer to look nice. They can be done a bit more speedy with things like washes and dry brushes. There's loads of good painting guides to getting your guardsmen looking nice on the table online here on YouTube. Games Workshop have a lot, but there's loads from other creators. If you're really unsure, then you could take a look at a few guides and maybe follow along with one that suits you. I certainly encourage that, as well as just going for which model theming you'd like to go for, to make your own regiment with their own colours and your own custom lore behind them. That's a big part of making them your guys. So sure, they could be Acadian regiments, but these ones can be the Acadian 208th, expert orc fighters out of the repeated invasions that have hit their sector. Talking of actually getting miniatures on the board, let's talk about the options for starting with that. And as with the painting things, I'd probably recommend starting out with a base squad of infantry, just to dip the toe in the faction before diving in a bit more thoroughly. Otherwise, you could look at discount box sets. There's an upcoming Combat Patrol Astra Militarum that could be one discount option, though unfortunately it hasn't really been particularly well received. Currently at time of recording, we haven't long had the Death Corps box set released, and the current Guard Combat Patrol isn't out yet, but we do know the contents of it. In the Guard discount box, there's going to be the Acadian Command Squad, 1 unit of 10 Kazakin, and then 2 units of 5 Attilan Rough Riders, all at the normal Games Workshop Combat Patrol price for £100, €130, or $168. Discount-wise, compared with some of the other sets in 10th edition, it isn't the worst, around about 35% off, though the amount of points that it gets you on the tabletop really isn't that much. You get slightly less than 300 points, so if you're actually just looking to get points on the tabletop, you would get more points for your spend from, say, a couple of Leman Russes. In general, this one really wasn't too well received, and it's fairly awful for a Guard starter box in my opinion, but maybe acceptable enough as an expansion box, provided you do like those Rough Rider cavalry, as if you don't want 2 units of those, then there's not really much point. In game, they're all solid enough options. The Rough Riders are pretty nice countercharge cavalry, one of the few good melee units that Guard have. The Acadian Kazakin are looking really quite good in the Codex, particularly in certain detachments like the mechanised one. Having their special rule work with transports again was a really big deal for them. An Acadian Command Squad are nice enough, could maybe combo with Lord Solar Leontus to broadcast his orders about the place. But just in general, if you want some big units of 20 moving into the midboard, then the command squads can be quite nice to support them. For the actual quality of the model kits, they're generally nice enough. They're all from the more recent era of Guard Sculpts. I feel like the command squad and Kazakin were really quite well received. The Rough Riders maybe divided opinions a little bit though. For some thoughts on assembling and equipping them, the Rough Riders don't really have that many datasheet options. The biggest deal for them, I guess, is the Goad Lance, which at the moment quite a lot of people choose just to leave off in favour of taking another Hunting Lance. It's not awful though if you want to model it, it won't really hurt you too much. For the models, they do have a bit of a different aesthetic to a bunch of the Guard, though just one thing to say about them is that if you do a head swap and replace the Attilan head for say Acadian or Death Corps one, it does give you really quite a different theme and feel to the model, and particularly when painted up to fit in alongside the rest of the regiment. Otherwise for the Kazakin, I'd be most tempted by melter guns and plasma guns as their special weapon choices, and I'd take the hotshot sniper and melter mine as well. Perhaps for the other special weapons, the other most interesting one could be the hotshot volley gun, which could take certain buffs fairly well and help with the infantry things. Finally, for the command squad, you generally take all the specialists, then add maybe a plasma gun on one of the spare guardsmen and a power fist on the commander. Overall, it's unfortunately not been one of the best Games Workshop model reveals, though I still think it's a box set that could help out in expanding an army. It just feels far more peripheral than the old one. Just in general, when buying Warhammer 40k miniatures, if you're new to the game, I'd certainly bear in mind the other places that you could pick up things aside direct from Games Workshop, and that's maybe more relevant for the Astra Militarum versus anything else due to how expensive they are. Games Workshop's Warhammer web store will be the most reliable but most expensive. Typically, the first port of call for plastic kits for me would be local gaming stores, official retailers selling the exact same thing as Games Workshop but for good discounts on the price. I've got a whole bunch of affiliate ones linked down in the video description that also help to support the channel on any kits bought through them. There's Element Games in the UK for 15% off, Gap Games in Australia for 21% off, Fenris Workshop in Canada for 10%, Wargame Portal in the USA for 15%, and Tash and Geldeep for 16% in the EU. There's loads of other great ones out there, they're just one example for a bunch of countries. And as always, a massive thank you to anyone supporting the channel via those, if you do happen to be picking up Warhammer 40k things anyway. Otherwise though, and particularly for the Imperial Guard, bear in mind the other places that you can get models. Guard being such a big established faction that have been around for a long time tend to have really quite a good resale market. You can often find collections of them turning up second hand on eBay. That can definitely be worth a look, and that was how I got into Guard myself, assembling an infantry army far cheaper than it would have been new via Games Workshop, via a whole bunch of second-hand Cadians. The quality might be a bit variable, but for mass ranks I feel like it's not the most important thing in the world. Otherwise, and again particularly relevant for the Guard, are 3D printers and third-party manufacturers. Normal humans in space with laser guns is a fairly generic trope, particularly given that there's so many different aesthetics that are sort of key to the Guard and in demand with their other regiments, and as a result loads of people have made their own versions of them of one sort or another. It really doesn't take too much effort to search and find them, just looking for a few proxy models online, either printed and delivered to you, or files for a printer if you have one of your own. It can be nice just even for some head swaps and things to give your regiment a different feel, or maybe getting your hands on some extra special weapons and things if you're trying to say convert Cadians to represent some Krieg units or similar to that. Otherwise though, for actual plastic miniatures and expanding the army that way, let's mention tanks, then infantry, and a bunch of discount sets, and then a few other ways that you could expand further. Certainly worth highlighting the Leman Russ, which is the iconic battle tank of the Imperial Guard. The vast majority of Astra Militarum armies would typically have a good few of these. There's loads of variation with them, with the various different turret options that you can have, and the tank itself is just pretty tough and fairly powerful with a bunch of big guns. When you're assembling these, I'd absolutely consider leaving the hull and sponson mounted weapons not glued into the little slot that they go in. They can hold in quite well with friction fit, so you can swap out between say heavy bolters or las cannons or sponson things as you need to, maybe using a bit of blue tack or a magnet if you wanted. If you are willing to go the little bit of extra hobby work, I really can't emphasise enough how much value I've got out of magnetising the turrets of my Leman Russes. Being able to swap them all out as Games Workshop inevitably changes the rules is kind of fun, plus just having a go with various different tank variants to mix things up and give you different experiences game to game. As it goes though, most of the variants of the Leman Russ are really quite playable right now for their various different roles. I say maybe the Exterminator is a particularly interesting one, being able to buff the rest of your firebase by marking a unit for extra AP on it. And typically for the hull and sponsons, most people run las cannons and then multi-melter sponsons, and it looks like this one's going to be remaining the default loadout for most people for the foreseeable future in 10th edition. In any case, as mentioned, the Guard tanks generally will be a good thing to prioritise a bit compared with some of the other things, given that they tend to have the best points per money spent ratio for the Guard, far more so than say the light transports and infantry. Beyond the super heavies, the other big tank of the Guard is the Rogel Dawn battle tank. This one was the new shiny and more recent kit that came out during 9th edition, really quite covered in guns and a great big armoured fortress. These ones are significantly bigger than the Leman Russes, filling a bit of a massive heavy tank role for the Guard. In 10th edition they've generally been really quite powerful in game. I'd say that the Rogel Dawn Tank Commander datasheet looks like one of the best ones initially from the Guard Codex. I have a feeling that we'll be seeing them in a allotted list in the future, and again they do have one of the better ratios of points per money of the Guard, even if they are significantly more expensive than the Russ. For Guard Infantry, if you're going via the plastic kits, as mentioned, it's likely to get kind of expensive, at least if you want a good number of them on the table, and often it does make sense to be able to field a bunch of platoon infantry units. As mentioned, loads of different ways that you can do them, and no one of them is really right. You could just go the very Games Workshop method and say get Kaschans to represent Kaschans in game, Cadians to represent Cadians, or you could say go full Cadian and then just use the Cadians with the right gear, so take Flamers in the unit to represent Kaschans, or convert yourself a medic or something to use as Death Corps of Krieg. Otherwise you can just completely go third party or 3D printed with a bunch of other models, which could be one of the best ways to represent other regiments. Just for one commonly shared one that's a really quite popular stand-in, Wargame Atlantic make a whole bunch of Great War Infantry, and various different sorts of those could represent a bunch of regiments at 28mm scale, so they do work quite well. I'd say they're not really quite to the same sort of quality as Games Workshop sculpts, though that really doesn't matter too much to my mind when they're all ranked up on the tabletop. These Great War Infantry, for example, cost around the same amount as a Cadian Shock Trooper unit, but instead of getting 10 models in the box, you get a big 35. I feel like that's enough of a difference to encourage a bunch of people to put some of those on the table to support their Games Workshop tanks and things. Finally, one other Games Workshop core offering that's probably worth mentioning are the Solar Auxilia. These ones are aimed at 30k, but pretty much that's Guard for the Horus Heresy. They're mainly armed with las guns and do have a couple of special weapons about, and in terms of models per money you get far more of them compared with say the Cadians or the Death Corps. Plus they have a pretty cool styling to them, I think, kind of industrial sort of carapace void armour. I've certainly seen some people use those as regular guardsmen, and some as elites like Kazakin or Tempestus given the extra armour. And the Solar Auxilia range also have a few other fun things, alternative style Leman Russes, which lack sponsons but have a different sort of aesthetic, and the Malkador tanks I feel like aren't the most unreasonable stand-in for a Rogel Dawn, at least if you're playing more casually. Otherwise, moving on to a few other options for expanding the army, it's worth talking about the recent Death Corps of Krieg box set and the other past Guard discount boxes. The Death Corps Krieg box is or was the launch box set for Guard in 10th, this one containing the new Guard Codex, new datasheet cards, 2 sets of Death Riders, 5 combat engineers and their bomb, the artillery team, and Lord Marshal Dreyer. This one was priced at £145, $230 or €180, though it did sell out really quite quickly in the USA and UK. Games Workshop web stores were out of them within the day in both places. There might still be a few left at discount retailers around the world, or maybe turning up in Games Workshop brick and mortar stores, as they usually have an allocation for physical box set sales as well, so it could be worth checking out a local store near you if you did want one but they managed to sell out too quickly. Theoretically, the discount on this one was around about 40%ish, though it still had a low number of points in the box at just over 400. It does really depend on whether or not you like the Death Corps, and in particular the Death Rider Cavalry or not, as they're quite a big section of the box set between the two sets of them and the Lord Marshal. It's certainly useful to have the codex and data cards at the start of a guard army, though I feel like the majority of the units maybe seem to be pointed a little bit on the high side, which isn't the best news right out of the gate, though given Games Workshop's regular balance passes, there's every chance they go down a bit in the future. Otherwise, talking combat patrols once more, and basically almost the entire internet agrees that the previous Guard Combat Patrol box set was better than the new one. When I put it to a vote for best value, 92% said the old one with the Cadians and the Sentinel. If you are looking to start Cadians, this one was a pretty reasonable pickup. 20 shock troops, 2 field ordnance batteries, a Sentinel and a command squad. They're going to be in kind of limited supply now. There might be the odd one or two in physical stores for discount retailers without such a big online presence, though quite a lot of them have gone off the internet, or at least at reasonable prices. Otherwise, for past discount kits, worth mentioning that Guard have had some in the past as well. There was the Cadian Defence Force, which is the box set that you'd want if you wanted multiple Rogue Aldorns. And before that, there was the Bastion Platoon, though they did have the older style Cadians, which might be a little bit of a lesser selling point now they've updated them. Again, kind of rare to find these at any sort of reasonable price these days. Otherwise though, aside from hunting for discount things for an effective Guard army in game, maybe worth talking about a few other options to expand. As a first port of call, I would be tempted to build up a good few infantry and some tanks for damage dealing. Hopefully that should get you a fair way towards securing objectives and also gunning down the enemy. In addition to that, Tempestus Scions can hit really quite hard jumping out of deep strike. Potentially units of 5 or 10 of those along with a command squad could either deep strike in or jump out of a Taurox or Taurox Prime, and they can be quite good both for direct damage dealing at close range with special weapons and also dropping in to do secondary objectives. I think Scout Sentinels are hard to go too far wrong with, just 55 points for a cheap, tough, fast scouting vehicle, and then one that's also got a las cannon and the ability to mark targets for other units. I'd rate these as one of the strongest things in the codex, though probably best to have small numbers of them. For leaders, I think a good number of things are pretty usable. Lord Solar Leontus is still an interesting centerpiece if you want him. He is quite expensive, particularly if you buy him a command squad and a platoon squad to go with, so he can broadcast his orders to a good chunk of the army through the Master Vox. But that does give you one really sturdy unit to hold a home field objective, and he rustles up a command point each turn, and then potentially his unit can actually move out to put his damage dealing to work later in the game. Ursula Creed is far less at 65 points, but she's basically the most efficient auto unit in the codex, as well as having a cheaper stratagem thing, discounting things nearby for regiment units. Pretty nice for a bit of Overwatch, or even the odd command point reroll on a big shot like a las cannon Sentinel or similar. If you want some Guard Tanith commandos along for the ride, Gaunt's Ghosts can jump on and off the table, and they're one of the best units for doing secondary objectives. Lone Operative stops the enemy from catching up with them, and then they can bounce on and off the table, blasting enemy infantry with their las carbines, maybe giving a few orders to nearby units, and also getting to the right place to do secondary objectives as they come up if you're playing tactical ones. Finally, if you're taking some elite damage dealers, maybe stuff like Kazakin, or maybe the Death Corps Combat Engineers, Chimeras or Tauroxes are pretty reasonable little transports. I feel like my favourite thing to put in them at the moment would probably be Cadian Kazakin. Scouting into the midfield and then being able to jump out and hit things hard with special weapons combined with orders, particularly if you're playing that mechanised detachment. If you are, then obviously Chimeras and Tauroxes are going to be the order of the day. Finally, along with good options to expand, again I'll just caveat the fact that Games Workshop seem like they are intending to balance the majority of units for most armies in 10th. There just seems to be the exception of artillery, fortifications and flyers for the Guard. It seems that their general balance aim just over the course of the edition is that all of these should be kept kind of barely usable or outright bad. The artillery does have at least some interesting options. The Basilisk can slow units, and the field ordnance batteries and the siege cannon can be okay against the right targets, but they're just charged a massive premium for their indirect firepower, mainly just because whenever indirect fire gets too strong it often tends to get spammed, and it can make for quite an interactive game, so that's why they often tend to put prices up on artillery whenever it gets good. Otherwise though, the Valkyrie and the Aegis defense line are just super weak for the cost. It's not that you can't put them on the table and still have a somewhat effective list, I just feel like at the moment they will be a drag factor compared with other stuff that you might take. In any case, all gameplay things aside, I'd always take that with a heavy dose of just collect what you like the look and feel of. Warhammer 40k rules and particularly power levels and things are always changing over time with balance updates and new codexes and other things happening. And as mentioned, besides a few things that are unusually neglected, the majority of the codex is at least usable. I think for most guard players around are likely to slowly and progressively build up a balanced core of an army and then add further elements that interest you, either to appeal to you from gameplay, look or feel, or wanting to build down that particular theme of the army. I'd certainly consider the combat patrol if you do like the horses, but in general start with infantry and tanks. Maybe if you're trying to build up to a sort of balanced army around about the 2,000 to 3,000 point sort of mark, maybe something along the lines of 30 to 60 infantry could be a good eventual target, and a few officers to lead them, maybe something like 3 Russes and a Rogue or Dawn. As said, I don't think it hurts to go heavy on the tanks at least early on, perhaps 2 to 3 sentinels and a transport vehicle or 2. Maybe artillery pieces if there's anything that's specifically desired, though I feel like there's certainly something that you don't have to at the moment at least, and then some support units as you'd be interested in, things like Ogrins, Scions or Kazakin for some damage punch, and units like Lord Solar, Creed and Gaunt's Ghost as mentioned can all be handy for current competitive lists. Lord Solar is definitely no longer anywhere near as mandatory as he used to be though. In any case, I just have a very rough idea of where you might want to go with a 2,000 point army list, building up towards it and playing games and adapting as you go. Finally, here's just one example of something that you could do as a starter army for the Guards. This one's just one rough idea for a combined arms regiment, definitely a long way from being optimised, but not going to be a pushover on the tabletop. And this one's using the general purpose combined arms regiment. And with this one I'm going from building around both the old Combat Patrol and the new Combat Patrol box set, though obviously if you picked up the Krieg box, then likely start around those units. For this one, for the main damage punch, we've got a couple of Rogue or Dawns fielded as tank commanders. They're taking the Oppressor Cannon and the Pulverizer Cannon, plus some multi-melter sponsons, so well equipped to take down enemy heavies. They'll be able to order themselves, and also they'll have a Leman Russ Exterminator and Executioner working with them, and they can take the other tank orders, plus the Exterminator can mark things for extra AP. We've also got some field ordnance batteries with bombast field guns to provide a little bit of indirect and thin out enemy objective grabbers, and 2 individual scout sentinels with las cannons that can be an interference threat and mark targets for the tank. Then to push forward a bit into the midboard, we've got a unit of Kashchan jungle fighters that you could just model as Cadians and run with flamers if you didn't want the aesthetic. I vaguely themed this one as a sort of Cadian kind of army, and they'll be delivered to battle with a Chimera with a couple of heavy flamers, so that should be quite a nice objective taking package there. We've then got a big Cadian block. For this one I'm putting the Cadian Command Squad and Ursula Creed in there, who should have enough regiment orders to cover all of the regiment things and be able to broadcast them through the Vox, allowing you to get orders to the Sentinels or the Artillery Rough Riders if you need to. They can guard the home field objective for a few turns with the field ordnance batteries, and then maybe push towards the midboard to put some OC down later. Also moving up to the front, there's a unit of 10 Kazakin in a Taurox. The Kazakin have melter guns, plasma guns, the mine and the sniper, and the Taurox should be able to get them within rapid fire range pretty easily. 2 units of Artillery Rough Riders will attempt to advance up the board while hiding behind terrain, and then hopefully that will punish enemies that try to move forward to try and attack the tanks or anything with a nasty countercharge, again potentially with a +1 weapon skill or extra movement broadcast via Creed. And then just for a little bit of secondary support, we've got 1 unit of Tempestus Scions that can drop in and do a secondary, or potentially put a bit of damage in on an enemy unit on an objective. And we've also got Gaunt's Ghost for jumping on and off the board, again doing secondaries and making a nuisance of themselves. In any case, hopefully it could be one good example of a somewhat balanced starter guard list, with a good mix of things rather than skewing to one theme, a mix of tanks, infantry, cavalry, artillery and specialists. In any case though, I'll leave that one there for now. Let me know your plans with starting Astra Militarum if you're jumping into the faction, and any other tips or tricks from seasoned players are certainly appreciated. Feel free to share your knowledge with newer players. Feel free to check out the other videos on the channel if you'd like to see more. I'll link my recent Codex review and the Astra Militarum unit tier list down in the video description if you'd like to take a look, and I'll certainly have a good few more guard videos coming over the next week or so. Feel free to subscribe or stay tuned if you'd like to see that. In any case, an absolutely massive thank you for listening. If you'd like to help support the channel and keep these videos coming, I'd just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description below if you've been enjoying a bunch of the videos. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways, with a chance to win some big model kits each month. In any case, an absolutely massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.